So I'm giving a lecture to a group of high school students tomorrow. They're at a Waldorf school, and they're seniors. They're taking a course that is called Symptomatology, and it's a concept from the work of Rudolf Steiner, who, of course, also designed the first Waldorf curriculum. Based on his understanding of the evolution of consciousness, sort of recapitulating in the life cycle of individual human beings and their societies. And so in this symptomatology course, where the focus is on the history of consciousness and a reading of history that incorporates a certain understanding of the evolution of consciousness, so that history is not sort of the rearrangement of pre-existing individuals into different forms of social organization. Rather, history is an evolution of consciousness, so that the very notion of what it is to be an individual is changing over the course of history. The way that people understand themselves, what it means to be a person in relationship to others in a society, other humans, other plants and animals, other angels and demons, right, for pre-modern people. And so when we study history from Steiner's perspective as a symptomatology, when we look at the exoteric events of history, the names of kings and queens and the names of wars and the dates of wars, and read history in terms of sort of economics and politics, we capture something of importance, obviously, but we miss the esoteric, right? The hidden, the secret dimension of history, which is the unfolding of consciousness, or the evolution of consciousness. So beneath the surface appearance, behind the news headlines and the mass media coverage of history and the narrative that's told by the public relations industry, there is a secret history. There is the interior life of each of us as individuals, and the ecologies of understanding that we manifest together, that we co-create through our semantic webs and, rhetorical performances, becoming with one another through the language and the cultural forms that we produce and reproduce. There's an inner dimension to history, and each of us participates in it, even if it doesn't end up on CNN or Fox News or in the New York Times or Washington Post or whatever. Steiner invites us into a reading of history as a symptomatology, meaning that there's a deeper disease unfolding, a deeper life cycle of the human species that gives us the meaning of history, because history itself on the surface just looks like sound, noise, war after war, struggle and failure, and increasingly mass death. I mean, the 20th century, it's like the best political critique one might offer of neoliberalism is the way that someone like Steven Pinker would try to use cherry-picked statistical analysis and framing to depict the 20th century as the most peaceful century in human history. That's, I think, the best example I can think of how neoliberal ideology functions, to ignore the social and ecological devastation that the 20th century ramping up of industrial growth, capitalism, and the extractive economy, the absolute ravaging of the earth that this mode of being has unleashed. It killed, hundreds of millions of people in various wars, but also just as a daily mode of operation, the whole capitalist system is killing thousands of people. And this is totally unveiled also by the government and industries, large corporations' response to the coronavirus to say, hey, we got to put people back to work, even if there is a increased death rate. Like, we got to sacrifice this number of human lives in order to save the economy, because the economy is the whole purpose of human life, right? It's as if the lizard overlords just ripped off their human masks, to reveal the true evil underlying the capitalist mode of production and the justification of that mode of production. As if to say, people were already saying greed is good, right, to justify this sort of unhinged capitalist mentality. Greed is good, right, and it somehow produces the greatest good for the greatest number of people through the invisible hand of this market god. But now it's even more, I think, brazen and on the nose, that just how blind this ideology makes us to the true meaning of history. To look at the 20th century and interpret its meaning as, wow, tremendous progress towards peace. Or for, someone like Pinker, peace means capitalist democracy, representational democracy, right? Where the moneyed interests and the elites can maintain control over the working class and the poor, as in the oligarchic representational system in the United States. Somehow that's peace. That's the ideal for Pinker. That's the best human beings could do, right? That is the end of history. A more esoteric reading of history, I think, reveals the way that the 20th century was really a tragic failure of the modern project. The modern project being this notion of an enlightenment rationality lifting itself up by its bootstraps out of a religious, superstitious past, so as to finally realize the scientific truth about the nature of reality and harness that reality for the benefit of all mankind, right? This is the modern Enlightenment project, and its attempt to dominate and master nature, rationally organize society. I mean, this mentality led to the death camps, right? It leads straight to death camps, which is exactly what we're building now as a response to the COVID crisis. We're building death camps, to catch all the people, the workers that are going to get sick when we try to restart the economy. We're building death camps to, collect them and shepherd them to death, right? That's the capitalist response to this global pandemic. Steiner is an esotericist, a spiritual scientist, as he would call himself, who wants us to look deeper beneath the superficialities of history to see the core, which is the evolution of consciousness. And in our moment, I would say there are different ways to talk about our moment in history, because some would say history is already ended, right? But certainly the evolution of consciousness hasn't ended, so history couldn't have ended either. And if we're going to understand our moment, we need to understand ourselves. History is always a story told in the present, and we tell stories in the present to justify our desires for the future. So it's not that history isn't real and hasn't happened, and that it's the material conditions, that are sort of given for each of us as individuals as we awaken and become conscious. There's a certain, we're thrown, as Heidegger would say, right? There's certain, from our ancestral, our family and ancestral inheritances, all the way to, the on an economic level. Like, we don't just learn our psychology from our parents, but we inherit wealth often in property. Some people are lucky enough to, at least, and then before that, our whole cultural and social inheritances, and we don't show up here as autonomous individuals, right? We grow out of these networks of inheritance and social relationship and economic lineage. And when we try to make sense of history as something that we enact in the present, it doesn't mean that I'm saying we can just start fresh, as if we're not already constituted by the momentum of the past, right? We are the momentum of the past, this cresting wave of social energy that long precedes, the existence of our own individual bodies and our own individual souls. So we're the cresting wave of this activity, but in the act, we as individuals, in the act of each moment of our conscious experience and each conscious decision and feeling that we experience, we are manifesting history, right? We are participating in its formation, and so we're receiving what has already happened. We're receiving our social and material conditions, and we're trying to make something of them creatively. We're trying to be productive, and when we think about productivity, we have to understand it, as Marx did, as a material process, an economic process, and a social process, but we also have to understand it as a spiritual process. And this is what Steiner adds to the picture. Consciousness isn't just materially and socially produced, it's a spiritual activity. And when we awaken to our spiritual activity, it is only then that we can become ourselves conscious historical actors. And so, Marx was all about raising the consciousness of the proletariat, but the problem is that consciousness merely of the true nature of our material and economic conditions, which is super important as a critique of capitalism, which obfuscates and ideologically covers over the true conditions, pretending to be somehow equal access and free. Capitalism, in fact, is the most disastrous form of slavery and oppressive form of enslavement that human beings have yet imagined, because it masquerades as freedom and liberation, when in fact it is exploitation. So Marx is important, but there's also a spiritual dimension to history and to individual consciousness, and it's not something that is otherworldly, right? And if anything, human freedom, is the becoming worldly of something that maybe was otherworldly but can no longer remain so. And so when we approach history from the perspective of the evolution of consciousness, we have to keep all of this in mind, and we have to be conversant with the current sort of neuroscientific and philosophical understanding of consciousness in our own historical moment. And so I think it's important to talk about modern philosophy going back to Descartes, and natural philosophy and science going back to Descartes and the Cartesian framework, where consciousness is conceived of as something subjective, and matter or nature is considered to be something objective. And while the two seem to be certainly entangled and related to one another in some way, they are in fact they have distinct operating principles. They have to be understood according to two very different, opposite, really, logics. Consciousness is intentional. Nature is determined. Consciousness is reflective. Nature is causal. Consciousness seems to have a temporal nature, whereas nature seems mostly to have a spatial nature, though the study of time in physics is rather the most metaphysical of the physical sciences, I think, because motion and rest makes sense, but when you try to add a dimension of time as something more than just mere change, in other words, time with a direction, a qualitative direction or unfolding, and in the physics of thermodynamics and chaos and complexity, you get this purposive teleological dimension to time that seems irreducible, even while in like relativity and quantum theory there seem to be different ways of just eliminating directionality altogether. In these other physics, like thermodynamics, non-equilibrium thermodynamics, and far from equilibrium, and chaos theory and complexity theory, the qualitative dimension of time is irreducible, ineradicable, and plays a role that needs to be included in our understanding of what nature is. And so the original Cartesian framework of modern science that separated subject and object, or consciousness and nature, doesn't work anymore. In the, I think, more contemporary, from within a more contemporary scientific framework. Descartes was living in a mechanistic universe, and I think operating with a linear form of, mathematical understanding of what extension is. And now that we have non-Euclidean geometries and understanding of, complex adaptive systems, and I think we're able to reintegrate the subject and the object, to think of consciousness as something that has always been a part of nature, and to think of physics like physical process, as something that has always been in some way ensouled and soulful and experiential from the beginning. That there's never been a physical process that wasn't in some sense already a process undergone by a locus of concern or self-presence or self-enjoyment, as Whitehead would say. That there is experience there. If there is anything, there is experience there. And so a reintegration of physics and experience, I think, follows naturally from a more contemporary understanding of science as the study of complex adaptive systems. Descartes was studying particles in motion, and that's not the picture that scientists have anymore of the universe. Rather, it's a picture of events in relation, rather than particles in motion. And in this more process-oriented understanding of the nature of the universe, consciousness finds a place again as part of an evolutionary process that is cosmological in its extent, so that, we're inheriting, social and material conditions, but those social and material conditions precede just our own species. They precede even life on Earth. We're inheriting the achievements of atoms in exploding stars, that we're able to merge with one another into symbiotic relationships to form heavier elements that became capable of more complex chemistry that eventually led to life, right? We are the ancestors. Those are our ancestors, right? We are their offspring. And whatever we're able to achieve in the present is, in a way, a gift from these parents who achieved a higher stage of existence, of coexistence. And so, we here today have a responsibility to inherit that legacy respectfully and to not waste our opportunity to contribute to this ongoing evolutionary adventure. And so to become conscious of history and to understand its manifest or exoteric form as a symptom of a deeper underlying meaning, and that meaning being about the evolution of consciousness, then I think we're better able to act in the present to change history and to seize opportunities that may never occur again. So, I was just reading Thomas Berry, his book, The Great Work, where he talks about how, whether in the natural world or in the human world, and again, these aren't two, I'm just talking, the human world is a particular mode of the natural world, right? So in the human mode of cosmic becoming, there are certain moments when transformation or metamorphosis, there's a window of opportunity for that to unfold, and it's narrow and it closes. And if you don't seize the opportunity, if the organic chemistry that gave rise to the first free living cells didn't seize a particular moment in the Earth's history when the oceans and the atmosphere and these early volcanic islands weren't in just the right balance to produce the conditions necessary for the translation of chemistry into biology. If that window of opportunity wasn't seized by those organic molecules in those shallow volcanic ponds, if Bruce Damer and his colleagues' theory of the origin of life is true, then if it didn't happen in that couple million years or so, about 4.5 billion years ago, then it wouldn't have happened, because the planet's geochemistry would have tended in a different direction, and life no longer could have emerged in that direction. So it had to happen when it did, right? And there's a possibility now, during this quarantine and this global pause, when billions of people, men, women, and children, are thrown out of the rush of modern capitalist life, forced to be with themselves. And if they're lucky to be at home, though I think probably the majority of the people who are being asked to quarantine are not even really able to. But I think right now it's one of those moments, these evolutionary opportunities where the window is open for us to make a leap to a deeper stage of our own evolution. And if we don't seize this moment, we may not get another chance for that. So, yeah. What are we going to do now? I think continuing to communicate with one another directly and not allow ourselves to be mediated by corporate PR campaigns, I think that is the best thing we can be doing right now. So let me know what you think about all this. And thanks for listening, really, as I try to sort out what the most salient issues are that I'd like to cover when I talk to this class of high school students tomorrow. Thanks for listening.